Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Spiritist Talk series promoted by the United States Spiritist Federation. We meet every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Today, I am so happy to be here and host this talk by our very special guest, Joe Mussi, who will be discussing the Good Samaritan, a parable made for Christmas. Before we turn it over to Joe, I would like to do a short opening prayer. And at this point, I would like all of us to maybe close our eyes and take a moment to connect with God, connect with all of our spirit guides, our benefactors, all of those who have blessed us during this journey on earth. May our dear friend Joe receive the inspiration during his talk, and that all of us be touched by his words. So be it. Joe, welcome. Welcome to our talk. Today, we're just a few weeks before Christmas. Hope you and your family are doing well. It is so good to have you here and to me discuss such a relevant topic, right? We bring to us the parable of the Good Samaritan, and Joe will highlight Jesus' teachings. In this parable of the Good Samaritan, Joe will remind us what Jesus teaches, which is the kindness should be extended to all our brothers and sisters. And it's a true reminder to all of us of the spiritual meaning of Christmas that we should never forget. Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe. Before Joe can tell us the message contained in this parable, I would like to formally introduce him. Joe Mussi is speaking to us from Toronto, Canada, where he has lived since 1990. Joe is a co-founder of the Toronto Spiritist Society, TSS. This Spiritist organization has the goal of disseminating Spiritist teachings in English. Joe was the president of the Canadian Spiritist Council, representing Canada in the International Spiritist Council. Joe has had has provided Spiritist speaking engagements. So that's a tongue twister right there in Canada, Brazil, the US, and the Middle East. Joe is Brazilian from Rio de Janeiro. He has a background in electrical engineering. And just a friendly reminder to all of us, please send your questions, send your comments using the chat window. Joe will reserve time today to address any of those questions once he concludes his presentation. Joe, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Marcia. It's always a great pleasure when I'm invited to speak to our friends in the US. Good morning to everyone. Hope everyone is going well, preparing for the holidays that are coming up very soon, and that everybody is still very safe from the pandemic that's still ravishing through this world and giving us a lot of things to think about. So anytime I get this invitation to speak at these lectures, I kind of have to think over what would I like to talk about, what would be interesting. And given the time of the year when Christmas is coming, I thought about talking about one of Jesus's parables, the Good Samaritan. I particularly like a lot talking about Jesus's parables because they're a combination of simple messages that are sometimes enigmatic. I remember, being brought up very young as a Catholic, that in Bible school, Bible classes, it's always the parables are really the essence of the education and trying to teach us some of the key messages that Jesus brought us in the gospel. And you might remember some things like this in the slide, some drawings, some cartoon-like stories that tell us the basic concept that the teacher's trying to impress upon us. I always found most of the parables easy to understand, even though there were some that that are more complex because they seem to defy the very logic of what Christ is representing until we have a very much opportunity to grow up and understand them fully. I also like parables, like many things, similar to what happens to us when we're reading the Spirit's book, is that you can read it many times, but every time you read it, it seems to bring in some new things, some new aspects of it, no matter how simple or short the message is. And this is why I like this parable, the Good Samaritan. It brings opportunity to discuss some important things that we must always remember as spiritists and as Christians as well. So at the end, I will, as the title of this lecture is kind of tie this back. Why I thought this was a very interesting parable for this time of the year, for Christmas. Usually, it's not associated this way, but I thought that there was an interesting angle that I like to bring and discuss with everyone who's listening here today. So, if we get started, it's a very well known parable, but it only shows up in one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Luke, and it's very short. Really, this is what you see here is the whole passage that we get from Luke, describing Jesus' exchange with a very high level doctor of the law, right? A master of the law. I won't read it now because I will take this and kind of bring it back step by step and kind of dissecting each one of these phrases one by one and kind of finding some interesting things to speak about. But in essence, as everyone here who is listening probably knows, it's a story about helping your neighbor, right? If you remember, just before this passage, Christ is exchanging some thoughts, some argumentation from this legal scholar, and he was challenging, Jesus about what is required to obviously go to heaven, to be faithful to what God wants us to do. And Jesus first asked him, what do you think? What is your understandings of the law? And the scholar tells him, love God above everything else, but then love one another, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then the question really came up, but who are your neighbors? Who do we have to love? And this is when Jesus then brings up this story, right? And it's an interesting story because it's simple in its very essence. It's about charity, about helping somebody else. But there's a lot of things that also he brings up, and a lot of nuances that has to also be contextualized to the time where Jesus was at over 2,000 years ago. So why don't we try to go a little bit deeper? Before we start in the breakdown, let's take this passage from the Gospel according to Spiritism. And this is found in chapter 15, item number 3. And it says, all the moral teachings of Christ resumes itself in the need for charity and humility. That is to say, in the two virtues which are contrary to selfishness and pride. In all of his teachings, Jesus indicates these two virtues as being the ones which lead to eternal happiness or reach us to the kingdom of heaven. Charity and humility are the two things which Jesus never ceased to recommend and for which he stands as an example. He also never ceased to combat pride and selfishness. Nor did he limit himself to the mere recommending of charity, but put it in a very clear and explicit terms as being the only condition for future happiness. Right? And as Kardec famously says, without charity, there is no salvation. So our salvation, our evolution, the ultimate state of pureness that we are striving, all relies us in being loving, in being providing charity and humility to help not only ourselves, but all of our neighbors, all of our families, all the people in which we will, at one point in time, interact, right? There is no bad side to charity. There is nothing that we need to be worried about except whether we're doing enough of it. And this is the real essence of this parable from Jesus. And it's a story, and it becomes a parable because he brings in a lot of things. And we're going to hear that he telling the story of this man who is going down to Jericho. Just a little bit of geographical context. Jerusalem is high in the mountains. If anyone has visited Jerusalem, it's very high in a plateau, and from there you can go down in all of these directions. But if you go east towards the Dead Sea, you will be going in the directions of Jericho, and it's a long journey. It's a few good kilometers. And so that's why in the parable it says that he was going down to Jericho. That's the geographical context, but there's also other things that you need to understand. The first interesting thing is that we're never told who the man is and why was he going down to Jericho? What was he doing? So at the time, it was often kind of assumed that Jerusalem was the highest moral place. This is the place where the temple was. This is the place where all of the important religious events happen, such as Passover. Now we call it Easter. And that it represented the highest kind of level of morality and pureness that you could find in Judea or in the region. Jericho was more of a party town. There were a lot of kind of merchants, a lot of activities taking place. So it was seen as a bit of a lower level, not only physically, but also morally. So when Jesus is using this example, he is saying that this man was going down to Jericho in a way that says that, well, we don't know exactly what he was doing, right? But he was going down in terms of possibly his morality as well. And this is important because we're going to see how this fits in into the whole discussion. I'll point out as well, the Samaria is shown at the top there. And we're going to be talking about the Samaritan. I mean, these days, when we talk the word Samaritan, the word good comes automatically to our mind because it has been so ingrained that Samaritan, to be a Samaritan is to be a good person, right? That we don't necessarily understand that back in the days, back when Jesus was telling these stories, Samaritans were the opposite of good, especially or particularly for the other Jews, because you know that there was a schism a few hundred years before when the 12 tribes were separated. They had a kind of a big dispute, and they broke apart, and there were the tribes of the north and the tribes of the south. The tribes of the north eventually get invaded by the Assyrians, and at that point, their beliefs and some of their way that they practiced the religion got mixed with some of the ones from the invading people, right, from the Assyrians. And the same happened later on with the Babylonians. So to the Jews at the time, the Samaritans were really even their enemies because they have, in the views of the Jews, kind of misguided views on what it means to be Jewish. And in that aspect, they were almost like enemies. There were a lot of disputes. There were a lot of infighting between them. And in some ways, to the Jews from Jerusalem and from Judea, they were actually, the Samaritans were even worse than the Gentiles, the non-Jews. So in the scale of everything, the Samaritans were the lowest possible kind of people that would happen. It's kind of how it is today between the Jews and the Palestinians, that kind of hatred that existed between them. So often in another passage in the Bible, we know that Jesus goes to Samaria And this is where he finds the Samaritan woman there as well. And there's a whole passage about the water. And it was very unusual that anybody who was a Jew from Judea would stop or even go to Samaria. So put that in mind, that the Samaritan did not have the context it has today. It had exactly the opposite context. And we have this story of a man going down. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So we don't know who the man was. We don't know why he was going to Jericho. We don't know if he was a Jew, if it was a Gentile, if he was a merchant, nothing. And Judas and Jesus makes certain that this is the way that he was going to be, because the identity of the man is not relevant to this story. He's talking about love thy neighbor. So the man represents any person, any man, any woman, any person that could be in the situation. So he's going down to Jericho and he's robbed, right? He fell among robbers who took everything. They stripped him, beat him nearly to death, and left him there to die, or if he wasn't already there. And he was, just lying there on the road, and he was alone, right? He needed help, and this was a road that was well used. There were a lot of people who would go back and forth. This was the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. So it's not surprising that after he was robbed, that somebody else would come by. So you think, okay, so let's see what they're going to do to help them. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So the first person that sees the man there basically looks at him and makes a decision that either the person is dead, or if he's not dead, he's going to be dead very soon, and I can't get my hands dirty. And that is literally what was the fact, that if a priest was to touch a cadaver, he would have to go through a purifying ceremony that was very arduous and very long. So they would avoid as much as possible, almost to the extreme, of going in and possibly touching someone who's already there. And also, he believed, he didn't know who the man was. He was already mostly half naked. He was left there. He doesn't know who the man was, where he came from. He didn't know if he was a Jew or didn't know anything. So to him was more convenient to turn a blind eye, to just ignore him and move on. And of course, Jesus is using these examples of people who will have the chance to help this man. And by all possible argumentation, these should have been the first people to actually do that. If you're a priest, if you're leading this your community in terms of what God wants and what we need to do, you would expect him to be the first one to follow the laws. And one of the laws was to love thy neighbor. And of course, he is more worried about what people will think about him if he does go there and touches this person or helps him, than what the person really needs. So he takes upon himself this position that his role in the synagogue was more important and should not be compromised by helping a total stranger that probably was already dead anyway. The next person who comes by, so this is Chico Xavier talking about these people. So you have the priest and we have the Levite who will come later. So in the book Our Bread, which is a fantastic book by Chico Xavier and psychograph, the thoughts of Emmanuel, they said the priest and the Levite represent the pastors of the religions who, instead of caring for the interest of the collective, they care about dogmatic interest in the cult of their churches. So what Emmanuel is saying here is that it is obvious that their priorities were wrong. The priority should not be a church, should not be the cult, it should not be any ceremonies that are required, but rather should be about the people, about the interest of the individual and the collective. We commonly find people who declare tired of practicing the good. Let's be, however, certain that similar allegations don't come from a pure source. Yeah, and this is a lesson for all of us, because at one point, if we're going to start measuring how much charity, how much good we've done, is it going to come to a point that we think, oh, I've done enough for this month. I'll leave my charity for next month. It's a completely kind of reversed idea of what we should be doing. In fact, we should be thinking about, have I done enough charity? Can I do more? Right? And Chico continues with, great prudence is essential when this or that circumstance induces us to reflect on the evils that assail us after the good that we believe we have sown or nurtured. If we get bored in the practice of good, such a disaster will express in truth that it has not yet been possible for us to emerge from ourselves evil. That's a very strong word, right? We get bored in the practice of good. If we understand that charity is the path, love is the path for our evolution, what does it mean when we get bored of doing it? It means that we have given up. Essentially, we're saying that we think we've evolved enough, and this is as far as we're going to go. And this is obviously what he says, coming from not from a pure source. Those thoughts are wrong. They lead us to the wrong path. They lead us to selfishness. It says, okay, if I think I'm bored of practicing good, what I will practice in its place is selfishness, because I will focus more on my needs than the needs of other people. Now, obviously, we're not saying that you should not care about yourself or your family and do things, but it is in the balance and how you put that equation together in your life that will really matter. When can you focus your activities towards goodness, practicing charity, practicing assistance to others? This is what will eventually drive your progress, being what we say, being a little bit better tomorrow than I am today. So if we continue on the in the Bible, we have Paul telling us, and you brothers, do not tire of doing good. So Paul's reminding us that exactly what Emmanuel was expressing in the previous page is that we cannot tire of doing good. That is the end of our path for salvation. It's the opposite of the direction that we should be going for. So we saw that the Levite didn't help, the priest didn't help, but eventually a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. And it's interesting what God says. He said he had compassion. That is a very strong feeling, right? That we have for one another. It is the essence of our ability to connect to one another. What he is implying is that the other two did not have compassion. They could not connect with the suffering of that poor man that was there in need of help. But the Samaritan got it. He had that exact feeling of compassion, that strong desire to help. And that's what he did. So he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to the inn and took care of him. So what he's doing is he's taking the man to the nearest place where he can be assisted. He took his own ride, right? Probably a donkey or a horse, and walked with him all the way to the nearest place, the nearest town where they had an inn, and took care of him. And that's what the man needed, right? Somebody to help him just get out of that position. He lost all his possessions. He was beaten. He was hurting. He was injured. He needed help. But the Samaritan didn't just stop there. He could have just simply taken him to the town and says, oh, guys, you go ahead, you take care of this poor man. He has been obviously attacked. Wasn't me, but I brought him here. And that would have been, already some charity. He would be helping him and then letting other people help that same man. But this Samaritan was, like he said, he was really struck with the compassion for the man. So not only did he take him to the inn, he goes beyond, right? He stays with him to the next day, right? And gives 2 pieces of coins, 2 denarii, and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, okay, this man is going to take a while. He's going to need some more time, right, to heal. Please take care of him. And whatever you need, spend. If you need to spend more, I will come back and repay you. So obviously, I would assume that the innkeeper probably knows this Samaritan. He probably is not the first time he was there. But in essence, not only did he take care of him on his immediate needs, but he's also supporting him for the other needs that he's going to have in the coming days until he can recover and then eventually find a way back home. So out of the 3 people who go through this, who pass by this man, we find that, at least from the view of the scholar, the legal scholar, that was the doctor of law, which they call him in the Bible, if he had told up front that there would be 3 people passing the road, the expectation of the doctor of the law is that one of the first 2 would be the ones to help him, not the Samaritan, because, as I explained before, Samaritans were deemed to be impure or not followers or not good enough in terms of being Jews. But in fact, what Jesus is stressing this, obviously, this is a parable. It's not necessarily a true story, but he's telling him that in our day-to-day lives, we can expect charity, assistance, help from different people. And sometimes is the person that you least expect who's going to step up and do the right thing. Come in, do what's necessary, and make sure that you're taken care of as you're required. At times, there are armies of creatures that teach charity. However, few people truly practice it. That is why charity, above all, asks for understanding. It is not enough to hand over possessions to the first beggar who appears at the door to signify the possession of sublime virtue. It is necessary to understand his need and to support him with love. To get rid of the afflicted, offering them the superfluous, is to get rid of the needy in an elegant way, with an absolute absence of spiritual enlightenment. Charity is much greater than almsgiving. To be charitable is to be deeply human, and those who deny understanding of others can reverse considerable fortunes in the field of social assistance, become a benefactor of the hungry, but will have to start at the first opportunity, the learning of Christian love, to be effectively useful. This is a beautiful passage that I pulled out from the book Lazarus Redeemed by Sheikh Xavier and Imam Brother X, right? And it's really profound in what it's telling us, right? So if we go back to the previous page, in his explanation here, in his dissertation, Brother Ask is saying that, yes, people need charity in terms of probably the material needs. So the man in Jesus' parable, needed physical help right away. He was beaten, he was injured, he was dying, he was probably thirsty, hungry. They had all of these needs that needed to be obviously addressed. But he also had other needs that are not just the physical needs. Um, he needed understanding, right? As we say, we needed to connect. The empathy of our connection with our neighbors is as important as whatever physical assistance we can give them. And this is why charity asks for understanding. So before you give a coin to someone on the street that's begging, try to connect with them, try to be empathetic to their needs, and that you're giving this truly as compassion, not just to get rid of that person or to make you feel good, is to understand that possibly one day, maybe you could be in a situation, not exactly as that, but who needs help. And how do you do it? How do you ask for help? How do you kind of need to be so humble as to understand that you need help? So this is why Brother X here is telling us that it's necessary to understand the needs of those we're going to help, and then support him with love, right? So it's not just simply to get them immediately resolved, but get yourself connected with your neighbors, understand the needs. And this is not just about charity. We talk about charity, we think this is about someone who's begging on the streets and we're giving a charity or whatever. Charity is much bigger concept. It's how we relate to each other at every point. So charity might be understanding a person, an elderly person who is alone and trying to go day by day, especially now that we have this pandemic, this is happening a lot, is to understand that they are suffering with their loneliness and see how we can help. It is obviously with your children, with your family, your spouse, your friends. The charity is to understand them before you fight them. Avoid the conflict by being charitable and understanding their needs and working with them in somehow in a way that they need to be supported. And and this is why Brother X is saying here that charity is much greater than almsgiving, just giving some coins or whatever. It is really connecting with those individuals. To be charitable is to be deeply, deeply human. I love that phrase, right? Because that is kind of the essence of the divine spark that it's in us that makes us understand all of the divine laws. And among them is love, right? Charitable is just the act of love. And it is kind of the most fundamental aspects of us as human beings. So I promised I was going to bring this all together back to Christmas. So as we know, Christmas is a celebration of the birth of Jesus, the Nativity Story. And in that story, if you remember, again, one of those things that we learned from Bible school, um, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph had to go back to Bethlehem because they were doing a census and they had to go back, even though Mary was in the later stages of her pregnancy. And they reached town and they can't find any place to stay, right? All of the inns, because everybody has had to go back and they probably left late because of her pregnancy. And they arrived and there's no place to stay. And they go door to door, all the inns are busy. And finally, someone lets them stay in a way that he could with the animals, right? And this is interesting. Doing the research for this part of the lecture, I understand that there are a lot of scholars who have different opinion exactly where Mary and Joseph were. I mean, they talk about being in a stable. Some people say it was a cave. And other people say that it was common at that time that people would have houses. They would have two stories in the house. That the top floor is where people would typically live and sleep. And the bottom part is where they kept their animals. So the other scenario is that they were allowed to stay at the lower level with the animals. not a very luxurious, but at least gave them protection. And as we know, at the end, Jesus is born and put in a manger. But interesting enough, just like we don't know who the man in the parable is, who is the man that was hurt, there's no name, no indication, nothing. It's also interesting that we don't know who was the person who helped Mary and Joseph, who gave them that little bit of charity that he could to help them stay while nobody else did, right? And imagine being that person, not knowing what great gift you gave to humanity by allowing Jesus to be born in a safe place. He probably never knew this, but ultimately it was his sense of compassion. And here's the word again that we associate very much with charity, love, compassion. He felt compassionate. He felt sorry for them. He needed to help them uh, at that moment of need. He understood that what they needed was a safe place to stay, even not necessarily the best possible place, but it was kind of kept them away from being outside and allowed Mary to give birth. So if we reflect upon this, imagine how many acts of small charities that we do that we often don't even realize um, the consequences of how important it is for this the person that you're helping, and what do we mean later on for them. To us, it might be something very small, but to them, could be something very, very important. And this is, again, a reinforcement that we shall not tire of doing charity, of helping, being good people. That's really what this man did to Mary and Joseph, which is being what we call a decent person. And maybe charity begins there, just in our decency of how we treat each other, how we talk to each other, and how we can provide assistance no matter how small they are. And you never know. Maybe what you're doing is going to be very, very important to the people, their lives. I'll tell you a personal story that we've learned. My father-in-law, who's passed away, he was a photographer. And he took a picture back in 1957 of a bus reaching Brasilia. And this photo became very emblematic of the migrants moving from other cities to help build Brasilia. And in the photo, there was a young boy, 16 years old, that was standing at the door. And we always focus on the picture. We always knew about the photo. And now recently, my wife published a book with the photos, and it became more public through social media. And through the social media, we find out that that man, that boy, 16-year-old, was given a copy of the magazine called Manchete at the time. And my father-in-law found him and gave him a picture, the magazine, and do a printout, because he saw that the young man was so happy to be in a picture. He'd never been in pictures before. He certainly never been published in a newspaper or a magazine. Well, when we were kind of doing the launch for this book, we find that we find out his daughter comes and tells us and says, "Listen, your father-in-law never knew this, but this photo was one of the most important things for my father. It gave them motivation. It was something that he was so proud of it. He kept this photo for many, many years in our house. And to the extent that it was so important to him that I eventually wanted to give my father a gift. So she actually had the photo tattooed in her shoulders in the back. And we never knew these things. And we get to meet him and the daughter. And it's so emotional because he remembers that moment exactly, the moment when my father-in-law gave him just a copy, a magazine and a photo. That for my father-in-law was something natural, was something that was what he thought was expected of him. And that story, that moment, became emblematic to the individual and to his family for 60 years. So, to close off the lecture, may you all have a wonderful holidays. And remember that no charity is too small, and never tire of doing the right things for those who are in need. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I'm open up for any questions.
Need to unmute myself. Sorry for that. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone who's here. Let's see if we have any questions for you or comments that you can address. So I see the first one where we hear, you mentioned, Joe, parables are simple and revealing different levels of meaning. Can you explain why did Jesus specifically choose to use this medium for conveying his teachings?
Well, to us, it might seem like he chose this, but if you go back 2,000 years, we didn't have, most people did not know how to read and write. There were no magazines. There were no, everything, the life was verbal. And lessons were given by word of mouth, right? People would tell stories. Storytelling was a natural way of teaching. So if you were an elderly, you would tell stories of the past and you would explain to them. And all of these teachings had a purpose. So they would tell stories, and not all of the stories were necessarily true. Some were embellished, some were changed for the purpose of passing on a specific message. So Jesus was just a man of his time, right? He was doing what others would do, right? Except, for example, in a religious aspect where it was very rigorous, the stories and all of the teachings. But in the colloquial, in the day-to-day interaction of people, these stories get passed on from one person to another, from grandfather to father to grandson, right, or granddaughter. So these were all very much verbal. And Jesus obviously needed to communicate with these people in their own language, in the way that they understood. So it was, to me, I would say it was the natural thing to do at that time.
Absolutely. Great thought about the oral tradition, right? And history. You remember. Thank you. Let me see if we have another one. Paul Jacoby. Hey, Paul, thank you so much for your question. He asks, it sounds as if charity is based more on the intent of love than the act of giving. Is that correct?
Well, I would say that the act of charity begins with the intent of love. But then there needs to be an action associated. So we can't just stop at the intent. So what we often say is charity is love in action. So you begin with the love and you make an action out of it. You do something, being empathetic, being listening, talking to people, helping them. These are the acts. These are the action that is associated with the first thought of love. So you're right. We start with the intent of love, but then we can't just stay on the intent and not do the action. We have to do the action too.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul, for the question. Let me see if we have another one. So we have the one that says, in a time of divided opinions and radical positions, how can we practice charity toward those that think different than us? Great question here.
Yeah, it's a great question and a very difficult question. Obviously, we're experiencing a level of radicalization of our ideas, of our beliefs that we hadn't seen before. And unfortunately, that same technology gives us the ability to have these virtual calls, is also allowing the proliferation of extreme thoughts. And I think what Brother X told us in that passage is fundamental, right? It's all about understanding. Understanding does not mean you agree. Understanding is that at least you try to see that other people might have different ideas and they may not be the same. And rather than focusing on our differences, we should be trying to focus on what we have in common and how we can find common solutions to the problems that we have. It's being loving. And again, it sometimes can be very difficult to find an agreement, but try to keep the dialogue open. Sometimes we have to break the dialogue just to give a little bit of breathing room across the sides. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that there is no breathing room because the this separation keeps being um, kind of increased through social medias and other things that we have that seem to make us harden us rather than make us more loving.
Yeah, I would even add something that when we start to talk about understanding, which does not mean agreement, right? In this case, but understanding in terms of comprehension, the larger view of who we are as people, as individuals. We all bring our own baggages, and that also means great suffering, even though we come from different, sense of what is right, based on our culture, based on those baggages. But thank you, Joe. We have another question here. If charity is the act of love and charity is to understand one's needs, what can we do to love more? How can we learn to better relate to one another?
Well, I think the expectations about my ability to solve the world's problems is very high right now. Um, I would say it's not a secret. It's listen. If we listen and we shut up and we just hear what the other side is saying rather than shout back, it's a start.
It's a
In
very
some
good
cases, we
point.
might be too far apart, but at least we're not kind of screaming at each other.
Yeah, I even would think that you mentioned just before we closed your talk. You said it may start with being decent, right?
Yes.
And being decent should include listening. So very very good point. How do we do more? Well, let's think how we start. Charity is talked a lot and practiced much less. What are we doing wrong?
Hmm. Well, in some ways, I don't think we talk enough about the good things that are done in the world. That's part of my view of why we're kind of separating or distancing ourselves because we talk about about the bad
Hmm.
things, the things that
Hmm.
we don't agree, right? And often we don't talk enough about the good things. There's a lot of charity going on. This is the people are essentially good people, and
Hmm.
they we haven't stopped being charitable, but we have started to be less understanding of those that we don't agree with.
Very good
Uh,
point.
so I think we need to talk more about the real charity, right? Which we heard in the passages. It's around understanding each other, connecting, the empathy that we have with each other. It's not necessarily just the money that we give to others, right? And we've
Correct.
seen a lot of good examples of love and charity during this pandemic so far. Still, there's always good examples and there's always bad examples. So let's talk more about the good examples and hope, like Jesus did, that by being a living example, you're encouraging others to do the same.
Love it. Love it. Thank you for that. I think this is a very very powerful message for us to not only understand the teachings of this parable, but also the call to action is, let us be more charitable, let us keep going in the path of learning to love in a way that is meaningful. But we have come to the end of our talk today. I just wanted to thank you, Joe. I want to also thank everyone who watched this live talk and those who have been following us, our weekly talks. This is a reminder that next Saturday, December 11th at 11 a.m. Eastern, please don't miss a great event. We'll have representatives of various Spiritist federations in the US speaking about the women of the gospel. I would like to invite all of you to come back and to listen to representatives of those federations, such as Dan Assisi, Ligia Carvalho, Lívia Uehara, Yasko Aracaya, Peter Hayes, and Marcelo Neto. But before we say goodbye, I would ask, Joel, would you mind please closing our talk today with a prayer?
It would be my honor.
Thank you.
Let us lift our thoughts to God, our Creator, who has allowed us to exist and to come here this day to hear these beautiful words that come from Jesus' gospel. It is always a blessing to be able to study and try to understand more and more the important lessons that our Master left with us. We also thank all of our spiritual friends who are always present in our day to day activities and events like this, who are inspiring us, who are encouraging us, who are guiding us in the right words, in the right thoughts to present and share among each others. And I thank everyone for coming here and joining us and spending this hour um, learning about these things. I hope everyone has a safe week. I'm looking forward to the lecture on next Saturday. Thank you very much. So
Thank
be
you,
it.
everyone.